Hey everybody, this is I believe, final entry from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. Um, this entry is titled U.S. Trotskyism, Other U.S. Trotskyist and ex-Trotskyist Groups. In addition to the Socialist Workers' Party and its dissidents of the 1982 to 84 period Shachtmanite offshoots, the Workers' World Party, Spartacus, and Workers' League, and their splinters, there have been several other groups in the United States since the 1960s professing loyalty to Trotskyism. Some of these have had association with one or another faction of the Fourth International. Most remained more or less Trotskyist, at least in their own view, although one of them carried out a strange evolution from far left to extreme right. The News and Letters Group. The oldest of these dissident groups was the News and Letters Group, established in 1955. The News and Letters Group had its roots in an old faction within the U.S. Trotskyist movement, the Johnson Forest tendency. Its principal leader was Raya Dunayevskaya. In Raya Dunayevskaya's earlier incarnation, Raya Dunayevskaya was known as Ray Spiegel, and under her, quote, party name, end quote, Freddie Forrest. For a while during Trotsky's residence in Mexico, Dunayevskaya had been one of his secretaries. Dunayevskaya subsequently described her assignments with him as being, quote, work on behalf of the Russian Bulletin and of the left opposition, end quote, some research work regarding Stalin, end quote. Both CLR James, Johnson, and Ray Spiegel, Forrest, had left the Socialist Workers' Party with the Shachtmanites. However, by 1941, they had formed the, quote, the state capitalist, end quote, tendency within the Workers' Party, the group which disagreed with Max Shachtman's description of the Soviet Union as being, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote. In 1945, they became officially known as the, quote, Johnson Forest tendency, end quote, within the Workers' Party. They finally split from the Workers' Party in the summer of 1947. The Johnson Forest tendency remained outside of any group for a few weeks and then re-entered the Socialist Workers' Party. Within the Socialist Workers' Party, as had been the case in the Workers' Party, they constitute a, quote, state capitalist, end quote, faction. In that capacity, the Johnson Forest tendency contributed a number of polemical articles to the internal bulletin of the Socialist Workers' Party. At the time the Johnson Forest tendency re-entered the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Workers' Party was engaged in a reassessment of their attitude on, quote, the Negro question, and so particularly welcomed the return of CLR James. CLR James delivered the report on that issue to the Socialist Workers' Party convention following his readmission. The Johnson Forest tendency left the Socialist Workers' Party once again in August 1951. By that time, as Kent Worcester, how do you say that? Worcester. I don't know. Has noted, quote, the tendency had broken with Trotskyism on almost every point, end quote. In October 1951, the Johnson Forest tendency established a new periodical as the rallying point for their ideas and organization correspondence. There were about 70 members of the group at that point. 7 issues of the periodical appeared, the last one in March 1953. Meanwhile, in November 1952, CLR James had been arrested. He was held at Ellis Island for 6 months and then was expelled from the country. With his departure, the Johnson-Forrest tendency as such came to an end. News and Letters Committees under Raya Dunayevskaya's leadership was formally established in 1955. A later statement of the organization on who we are and what we stand for noted that, quote, News and Letters was founded in 1955, the year of the Detroit Wildcat against automation and the Montgomery bus boycott against segregation, activities which signaled a new movement from practice which was itself a form of theory. Volume 1, Number 1 came off of the press on the second anniversary of the June 17, 1953, East German revolt against Russian state capitalism masquerading as communism, in order to express our solidarity with freedom fighters abroad as well as at home, because 1953 was also the year when we worked out the revolutionary dialectics of Marxism in its original form of, quote, new humanism, end quote, as well as individuality, purified of all that interferes with universalism, i.e. with freedom itself. We organized ourselves in committees rather than any elitist party, quote, to lead, end quote, end quote. The form of organization of the News and Letters Committees had been unique for a Marxist revolutionary organization. As Andy Phillips commented in News and Letters early in 1980, quote, the form is a decentralized committee structure of freely associated local groups and individuals acting through and with a centralized national editorial board responsible for implementing decisions determined in the process of free and open discussions at annual plenary sessions and conventions, We choose the committee form of organization because it permitted the greatest flexibility and did not preclude any future organizational development. We are not opposed to the political party form on principle. We are opposed to the concept of the vanguard party to lead the masses and the practice that flows from that. End quote. Each successive annual conference of the group drew up its interpretation of the current scene and its program for activities during the coming year. All these statements were presumably prepared, debated, and accepted in the context of the Marxist humanism developed by Raya Dunayevskaya. The draft perspectives thesis prepared for the 1980 annual meeting of the group noted that, quote, first and most important, of course, is the expansion of News and Letters into a 12-pager, which at one and the same time calls for the creation of a nucleus to write theoretical analyses of burning issues as they happen, and a forum for workers, blacks, women, and youth to speak for themselves, end quote. The document went on to say that, quote, naturally this means expansion of all our activities, especially with the unemployed, especially with the youth in its fight against the proposed registration for the draft, especially with the black masses as a whole, who are the greatest victims of the present recession and who have already demonstrated their passion for revolt and totally new human relations, and especially with the women's liberationists internationally as well as nationally, who have not only deepened and expanded their activities, but are everywhere also involved in the most serious theoretical reconsideration, end quote. In spite of the implications of this 1980 document, the News and Letters Group and its members were carrying on organized political activities in several different fields. Most of the attention and efforts of the group appear over the years to have been concentrated on issues and issuing and circulating the newspaper News and Letters, together with the variety of pamphlets and books issued by the organization. Key to all of this was the propagation of the Marxist humanist ideas of Raya Dunayevskaya. News and Letters is the particular pride and vehicle of the organization. The previously cited statement, Who We Are and What We Stand For, commented that News and Letters was created so that the voices of revolt from below could be heard, not separated from the articulation of a philosophy of liberation. A black production worker, Charles Denby, author of Indignant Heart, a black workers' journal, is the editor of the paper, end quote. Charles Denby, Matthew Ward, was associated with Raya Dunayevskaya from the late 1950s. Denby was an auto worker, participated in various insurgent movements against the Reuther regime and the United Auto Workers, and was for several years a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. In his autobiography, Charles Denby, commented that, quote, I was never happier at any time in my life than when I left the Trotskyist party, end quote. There is no doubt about the fact that the News and Letters group centered on Raya Dunayevskaya and her ideas. Charles Denby called her book Philosophy and Revolution, quote, the most fundamental statement of Marxist humanism, end quote. Lou Turner of the group has commented that, quote, I think that all understanding of what is meant by Marxist humanism turns on comprehending Dunayevskaya's contribution to Marxist philosophy with her book Philosophy and Revolution, end quote. The position of Dunayevskaya as the axis of the News and Letters group was clear in the draft perspectives thesis prepared for the 1980 convention of the group. It had commented that, from the vantage point both of the objective situation and of the need to assure a new stage of organizational development, we need to bring the archives of Marxist humanism up to date with the completion of the draft of the book Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution. There is not a single problem today which is not illuminated by that study, ... End quote. The archives referred to were those of Raya Dunayevskaya in the Wayne State University Library. Early in 1968, there was an effort made to establish a youth section of the News and Letters group. Eugene Walker, commenting on this attempt, said that, quote, the challenge of trying to establish a Marxist humanist group to aid in this is a hard, serious one. The first step is to break with the distortions, slanders, and slogans which either vilify or pass for Marxism. ... Theirs must be the task of infusing the pluridimensionalism of Marxism into a movement whose possibility for fulfillment resides in breaking out of its pragmatic mold into a fully conscious human activity for full freedom, end quote. A group of students, including high schoolers, began publishing a periodical, The Young Marxist Humanist, which included a greeting entitled, quote, The Heritage and Challenge, end quote, by Raya Dunayevskaya. However, there is no indication that a News and Letters youth group was actually established. The News and Letters group was not associated with any of the international Trotskyist tendencies. It is clear that it was no longer Trotskyist in spite of its origins. Rather, it was a group organized around the ideas of Raya Dunayevskaya, based supposedly on the early philosophical writings of Marx and some of those of Lenin. Lou Turner has commented that, quote, we have not had any splits in News and Letters, nor have we merged with any other group or tendency. Internationally, we continue to develop relationships with revolutionaries who have broken with all state powers. From Mao's China to Castro's Cuba, there has developed a British Marxist humanist group which will be issuing its own British supplement to go with News and Letters this year, end quote. I felt like I was going to say something there. Yeah, there's like a step away from Trotskyism, but the step away from Leninism is very ambiguous. On my channel, I have a piece that I read like a while ago by a guy named Matthew Quest, and it's from Insurgent Notes. Matthew Quest being something of he's written a few works at least on, I think it might be his main thing actually, is C.L.R. James. It says C.L.R. James, like, complicated, misconception of Lenin's role in the depletion of working class democracy in the USSR, particularly on the local scale. I believe that's what the paper's about, but it's a good one. Even if I can't remember the main thrust of it. But it's basically like C.L.R. James never thoroughly broke with Leninism, and to the author's mind, he should have. And I don't know about Raya Dunayevskaya. I think the politics that they suggested there, of the... It says, internationally, we continue to develop relationships with revolutionaries who have broken with all state powers. From Mao's China to Castro's Cuba. I don't know if that meant I don't know exactly what the content of that is, in terms of like what it means for um, news and letters and Marxist humanism, at least early Marxist humanism's relationship with Leninism. The Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party. The Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party, CRSP, which had its first national conference in October 1978, had its origins in several groups which had broken from the Socialist Workers' Party over the previous 15 years or more. These included the Freedom Socialist Party based in Seattle, Washington, the Socialist Union in California, and a group around Murray and Myra Tanner Weiss in New York City. The Freedom Socialist Party originated principally with the Seattle branch of the Socialist Workers' Party, which split with the national organization in May 1966, and a few weeks later, together with a few people who had not belonged to the Socialist Workers' Party, met to establish the Freedom Socialist Party. The Freedom Socialist Party's principal divergences from the then current Socialist Workers' Party position were, quote, over, quote, 1. Revolutionary integration as the direction of the black liberation struggle. Blacks in the U.S. cannot end their special oppression by turning in a nationalist separatist direction, and in the course of fighting for their rights will most likely take their rightful place as the vanguard detachment of a working-class socialist movement. 2. The first-rank importance of women's rights in both theory and practice within the party, the mass movements, and on the general political scene. End quote. Subsequently, the Freedom Socialist Party, as well as the CRSP, continued to put great emphasis on, quote, socialist feminism, end quote. The Freedom Socialist Party held its first conference in January 1967. At that time, the party established a somewhat peculiar form of organization, and certain factional differences appeared within its leadership. It elected both an executive committee and a literary and correspondence committee. The former was controlled by Clara Fraser, the literary and correspondence committee by Mr. Kirk, who had been a member of the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee, and Frank Krasnovsky. A dispute arose as to which of these two organizations was the highest authority within the new party. After considerable struggle, the Fraser Group won control of the Freedom Socialist Party, an event which was hailed by the winners as, quote, a victory for socialist feminism, end quote. The Freedom Socialist Party continued to be largely under the influence of Clara Fraser. In 1968, she organized Radical Women, a radical feminist group. Clara Fraser won considerable attention in the late 1970s as the result of a suit she brought against the Seattle City Light Company, which had dismissed her as education coordinator in charge of a special program for training women and minorities for jobs in the enterprise. The Socialist Unionized was organized by Milton Zaslow. Mike Bartell, who had first left the Socialist Workers' Party with the Shachtmanites in 1940, but subsequently had returned to the Socialist Workers' Party. By the early 1950s, he was organizer of the Socialist Workers' Party local in New York, and in that capacity sided with the Cochranites at the time of their split with the Socialist Workers' Party. After the Cochranites' expulsion, he had a small group of his own around 1955 until 1955, when he retired from active radical politics for a number of years. In 1969, Milton Zaslow organized a group in Los Angeles where he had moved, which finally took the name Liberation Union. Then, in early 1970s, when the internationalist tendency was expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party, he joined forces with some of them to organize the Socialist Union. The third group of Socialist Workers' Party dissidents, which joined to establish the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party, was centered on Murray and Myra Tanner Weiss in New York City. Murray Weiss had for long been a major figure in the Cannon faction in the Socialist Workers' Party, and Myra Tanner Weiss had also been a top figure in the party and its candidates for vice president of the United States in the 1950s. They had been disillusioned in the, quote, single issue, end quote, turn of the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1960s, and with Socialist Workers' Party leadership's impatience with any organized criticism of its position. Myra Tanner Weiss had cast the only vote in the political committee against the expulsion of the group around James Robertson, who were subsequently to form the Spartacist League. The Weisses had dropped out of the Socialist Workers' Party, but apparently until the late 1970s had not belonged to any other group. The Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party was first conceived of as an organization to group together elements outside the Socialist Workers' Party who still considered themselves Trotskyist and had positions opposed to the supposed, quote, opportunism, end quote, of the Socialist Workers' Party. It was not itself originally intended to become a democratic centralist Trotskyist party. The Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party had its first national conference in Union, Washington from October 6 to 9, 1978. There were reported to be 100 people in attendance, including members and fraternal representatives. The meeting adopted two resolutions which they regarded as, quote, crucial, end quote. One was, quote, Theses on the Crisis of the Fourth International, end quote, and the other, quote, National Tasks and Perspectives for the CRSP, end quote. The document on the Fourth International was oriented towards the United Secretariat and seemed designed to appeal to the European leaders of the United Secretariat Executive Committee. One second. Of the United Secretariat to break with the Socialist Workers' Party and to accept the elements grouped in the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party as a true representative of Trotskyism in the United States. An official report of the conference said that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party is criticized in the theses for its, quote, implacable hostility, end quote, to the burgeoning women's caucuses within the Fourth International, and the International is asked to, quote, struggle against the two fatal afflictions of the Socialist Workers' Party USA, Stalinophobia and sexophobia, end quote, which, along with bureaucratism, have occasioned a catastrophic shift to the right within the organization. The International is further warned that its, quote, sweetheart agreement, end quote, with the Socialist Workers' Party on the, quote, turn to the proletariat, end quote, is fraught with danger for world Trotskyism, end quote. The conference also adapted a reply to a letter from USEC refusing the CRSP request to participate in discussions preparing for the next World Congress of the United Secretariat. It called this letter a, quote, high-handed ukase, U-K-A-S-E, I don't know what that means. Ukase is an edict of the Russian government. It's also known as a arbitrary command. He called this letter a quote, high-handed ukase, end quote, and added that, quote, you have deepened your policy of pursuing an unprincipled bloc with the Socialist Workers' Party at the expense of the principles of Trotskyism, end quote. The other document on national tasks and perspectives was adopted unanimously and, quote, opens by reaffirming commitment to the liberation struggles of workers, women, racial ethnic minorities, and gay people, and to the promotion of workers' democracy in every sector of social and political struggle. And it hails the upsurge of socialist feminism throughout the world as a thunderous component of global revolution, end quote. The resolution was orthodoxly Trotskyist in proclaiming that, quote, the proletariat is the central force in the overthrow of capitalism, end quote, but somewhat less orthodox in adding that, quote, we anticipate that in the United States the vanguard of the proletariat will be composed in its majority of women, oppressed racial and national minorities, and gay people, end quote. The document reiterated the old Trotskyist call for a labor party. It also asserted that, quote, privileged layers within the working class and skilled trades insularity breed reactionary habits and practices that deepen the gulf between the privileged and most oppressed workers and thereby dissipate class independence and worker solidarity against management, end quote. Therefore, it called for all CRSP trade unionists to support the, quote, most oppressed layers of the working class, women, minorities, gays, radicals, undocumented workers, etc., end quote. The Tasks and Perspectives resolution seems to emphasize the role of the CRSP as a kind of Trotskyist united front. The official report on it noted that the document concludes with an invitation to other radical groupings and individuals to join the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party and participate in the construction of the World Party of Socialist Revolution and, quote, victorious worker internationalism, end quote, end quote. It was announced at the meeting that the Trotskyist Organizing Committee, TOC, the Turnerites, had decided to affiliate with the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party, and that Earl Owens was there representing the Trotskyist Organizing Committee. With the split of the United Secretariat in 1979 and the establishment of the Parity Committee for the reconstruction of the Fourth International by the United Secretariat faction headed by Nahuel Moreno and by the Lambertists, the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party sought alignment with this new Parity Committee. Murray Weiss wrote a letter as Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party National Coordinator to the Parity Committee, quote, with the aim of reaching a close collaboration and systematic correspondence in the struggle against the opportunism and bureaucratic monolithism within the Fourth International, end quote. The Murray Weiss letter outlined the positions of the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party at the time. It expressed sympathy for the stands that the Moreno faction had taken, particularly on the revolution in Nicaragua. Weiss also commented that, quote, the unity, end quote, of the United Secretariat with the Socialist Workers' Party under the demagogic slogan of proletarianization has not been consummated because of the absence of principal difference. In fact, the political schism is widening, end quote. Insofar as the Socialist Workers' Party was concerned, Weiss wrote that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party USA has lost its corrective power for learning from mistakes by eliminating the full play of party democracy, ... Bureaucratic norms prevail in the Socialist Workers' Party USA. The Socialist Workers' Party USA must not triumph in the International, end quote. Over the July 4th, 1980 holiday, the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party held a Seattle meeting of the plenum of its steering committee on the theme of, quote, faction struggle, reconstruction, and new horizons, end quote. The 3-day meeting dealt with internal struggles within the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party, various world crisis areas, quote, the split in the Fourth International, end quote, and, quote, the American question, end quote, among other matters. It was also there that its program for reorganizing as a disciplined party instead of a loose coalition of groups was apparently adopted. There was considerable opposition within the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party to converting it into a single democratic centralist group. Harry Turner has observed that after that decision, his group, the Trotskyist Organizing Committee, as well as the Socialist Union and Myra Tanner Weiss, declared the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party to have been dissolved and went their separate ways. Murray Weiss, who had joined the Freedom Socialist Party, remained with the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party. One second. Yeah, it says, I'm looking at the Wikipedia for Freedom Socialist Party. It says it's a left-wing political party with a revolutionary feminist philosophy based in the United States. It views the struggles of women and minorities as part of the struggle of the working class. It emerged from a split in the United States Socialist Workers' Party in 1966. The party's Seattle branch, with support from individuals in other cities, split off from the Socialist Workers' Party over what it described as the Socialist Workers' Party's entrenched opportunism and undemocratic methods. The party has branches and members in the United States, as well as Australia, England, Germany, and New Zealand. The current National Secretary of the Freedom Socialist Party is Doug Barnes. Yeah. One second. Sorry, this next section is the Internationalist Workers' World Party, Fourth International. One of the most recent Trotskyist groups to be established in the United States is the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International. It also has the distinction of being perhaps the only U.S.Trotskyist organization drawing its leadership and membership principally from people of Latin American origin. As such, the Internationalist Workers' Party became the United States affiliate of the faction of International Trotskyism led by the Argentine Nahuel Moreno, the head of the Fourth International Workers' League. Fourth International. Alright, I gotta make sure I'm pronouncing that guy's name right, because I've been saying it all the time. Spanish to English. I think H's are silent. If I took fucking Spanish in undergraduate.
Nahuel Moreno. Nahuel Moreno.
Nahuel Moreno. I was saying it right, because I'm a fucking genius. Leon Perez, the national organizer of the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, has described the origins of its predecessor, the Revolutionary Workers' Frente Revolucionario de los Trabajadores. Leon Perez wrote that in 1982 that, quote, our organization was founded by two comrades of the International in March 1980. Shortly after that, a group of militants in exile belonging to the Nicaraguan FSLN joined them. Some individual members of the Socialist Workers' Party also joined, The rest of the militants and sympathizers in our organization were won over through general political work with independent workers. We presently have about 120 members in 7 cities of the United States, Our work is primarily among workers and minority groups in the U.S., Latinos, and blacks. We sell 2,500 copies of each issue of El Bolshevik, and 1,300 copies of each issue of Working Class Opposition. We have already built fractions in 10 different unions, end quote. In 1982, the Revolutionary Workers' Front merged with the tendency led by Harry Turner, at that time called for the Revolutionary Unity League, to form the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International. This merger came about largely as a result of international contacts. When the split in the United States occurred in 1979 over attitudes toward the Nicaraguan Revolution, and the faction led by Nahuel Moreno formed a parity committee with the Lambertist tendency, Harry Turner's Revolutionary Unity League sought to affiliate with that committee. A Lambertist representative met with them in New York but refused association of them with the committee when Harry Turner raised an issue of disagreement with the Lambertist attitude a decade earlier towards the Bolivian Trotskyist group led by Guillermo Lora. When the Moreno and Lambertist forces split once again and the Moreno tendency held a World Congress to reorganize its faction in January 1982, the Revolutionary Unity League of the United States sent a delegate to that meeting. So did the Revolutionary Workers' Front, which owed its origins to the breakaway of the Moreno forces from the United Secretariat. Partly as a consequence of the intervention of the international group, quote, a national leadership team was set up to coordinate the editing and distribution of El Bolshevik and working-class opposition and plan joint participation in demonstrations, strikes, and political campaigns around Poland, El Salvador, Central America, etc., end quote. The two groups also discussed political issues between them, as a result of which, quote, the political differences which had existed between the two groups were notably reduced, end quote. As a consequence, joint documents were elaborated for submission to a unification convention. The convention met on June 26 to 27, 1982. Out of it came the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International. The convention ratified affiliation of the group with the International Workers' League, Fourth International, and adopted a draft political resolution defining the new party's political position. It also elected a 9-member Central Committee: Harry Turner, Leon Perez, Susana Fernandez, Roberto Cardenas, Loretta Silis, Carol Williams, Ana Gomez, Rolando Cordoba, Mark Elliott, and an alternate member, Frederico de Leon. A Control Commission made up of Susana Fernandez, Numa Alvarez, and Sonia Morales was also elected. At its first meeting, the Central Committee named a political bureau consisting of Harry Turner, Leon Perez, and Ana Gomez. Leon Perez was chosen as national organizer. The founding convention of the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, adopted a political resolution which ran to 75 pages. It defined the new party as, quote, an action-oriented propaganda group, end quote. It called for establishment of a labor party and provided that, quote, the International Workers' Party, Fourth International, would participate in a movement for the formation of a labor party, but maintained its own program, publications, and fight to transform it into a truly revolutionary party, end quote. The political resolution emphasized that the, quote, immediate task of any organization which calls itself revolutionary is to work among the black masses in the United States, since they are one of the most potentially revolutionary groups in our society, end quote. It promised, quote, to fight against chauvinism and racism in all its manifestations within the U.S. working class, end quote. It also contained, quote, a reaffirmation of the political line of the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, which considered immigrant workers as an integral part of the U.S. working class and its struggles, end quote. The political resolution proclaimed that, quote, true women's liberation will only be achieved in a society where collectivist work frees women from the slavery of housework. In other words, only in a socialist society will women achieve that liberation, end quote. It also provided, quote, as a sub-item on the women's question, the defense of democratic rights for gays, including the right to maintain their own lifestyles and sexual relations, end quote. The document provided for the new Central Committee, quote, to prepare new chapters of this document about youth, our characterization and political orientation toward other left forces, and our electoral activities, end quote. The founding Congress of the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, also adopted the statutes of the new organization. It was noted that, quote, several sources were drawn upon in preparing the proposed statutes of the new unified organization. The previous statutes of the RWO, FRT, parts of the RUL statutes, and the statutes of the International Workers' League, Fourth International, adapting the proposed national statutes and as much as possible to the international definitions, end quote. This constitution provided that, quote, the Central Committee will guarantee by all possible means the right of tendencies and factions to express themselves and to reach party comrades with their positions, end quote. However, such factions or tendencies were to be only for periods of pre-convention discussion and only if formed, quote, around political documents published by the Central Committee or Political Bureau. Tendencies or factions must submit notification in writing to the Central Committee or the Political Bureau that they will respect and observe democratic centralism and that they agree to respect all and each part of the statutes, end quote. The Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, continued to have its major base in California, particularly among Spanish-speaking workers there. In 1983 to 84, it opened 3 headquarters in Los Angeles, San Jose, and San Francisco. At its 4th regular Congress in July 1984, there were present, quote, delegates, special guests, and observers from New York, Philadelphia, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Chicago, San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco, Long Beach, Santa Ana, and Los Angeles, end quote. Much of the organization's effort centered on putting out and distributing 2 newspapers, Working Class Opposition and El Bolshevik. They regularly carried news not only about the organization, but about strikes and other labor situations, and considerable international news with particular emphasis on events in Central America. By August 1984, the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, claimed a combined circulation for the 2 papers of 12,000. Where am I? In at least 2 situations, the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International members were active in trade unions. These were in the Civil Servants Union in New York City and the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union in San Francisco. Electoral action was centered particularly on the Peace and Freedom Party, a legally recognized organization in California. The Peace and Freedom Party primaries in 1984, they backed 3 successful candidates. These were Sonia Cruz, a Salvadorian immigrant who ran for the state senate from a Los Angeles district, James Green, who is nominated for Congress from the 24th district, also in Los Angeles, and John O'Brien, running for the state assembly from the Hollywood area. On a national level, the party was, quote, urging you to cast your ballot against the Democrats and Republicans and for those parties and candidates who consider themselves to be socialist and part of the working class. In those states where the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' World Party, and the Communist Party candidates are running against each other, we urge you to support the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' World Party, and the Communist Party in that order, end quote. The Internationalist Workers' Party devoted some attention to trying to bring together many of the groups and factions in the United States professing loyalty to Trotskyism. In June 1983, it organized in Los Angeles an emergency national Trotskyist conference. Nothing concrete emerged from the meeting, however. A year later, the party began working on a second national Trotskyist conference and was having an exchange of correspondence with the Revolutionary Workers' League, looking toward possible reunification of the 2 groups. Some reflection of the composition of the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, is seen in the new Central Committee elected at its 1984 Congress. Quote, among the 18 members elected from a list of 21 nominees, there are 8 Latinos, 1 black, and 9 white workers. 7 members are women and 11 are men. All Central Committee members are workers. 7 are active union members. There is even a balance in the age span of the comrades elected. Among the members and alternate ones is less than 27 are between 20 and 30. Another 7 are between 30 and 40, and 3 comrades over 55. End quote. In July 1984, a severe factional struggle began in the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International. Neither side published details of the major issues at stake in the conflict. After unsuccessful efforts by the International Workers' League, Fourth International, to bring together the 2 factions of its U.S. adherents, The International Workers' League Fourth International Executive Committee decided to continue to recognize the Internationalist Workers' Party as its United States section and to recognize the dissident minority group as a, quote, sympathizing section, end quote. The dissidents established the Internationalist Social League Fourth International, which in November 1985 began publication of a monthly newspaper, Workers' Organizer. Among those issuing the newspaper were Harriet Turner, Susanna Fernandez, and Carol Williams of the original Internationalist Workers' Party Fourth International Central Committee. The paper indicated that the new league had branches in Los Angeles, Minneapolis, New York, and Wisconsin. The Revolutionary Communist League Internationalist. The Revolutionary Communist League Internationalist, or RCL, had its origins in the Workers' World Party, Spartacist League, and the New Left of the 1960s. The positions it assumed on various issues showed evidence of all these sources. One of the leaders of the group, I. Mahareb, has written that, quote, we trace our distinct ideological origins to the little-known, quote, global class war, end quote, tendency in the Socialist Workers' Party, which formed around the oppositionist work of Sam Marcy and Vince Copeland between 1950 and 1959. The tendency left the Socialist Workers' Party to form the Workers' World Party, end quote. However, although the, quote, ideological origins, end quote, of the RCL Internationalist may have come from the group which formed the Workers' World Party. Organizationally, the group began a split from the Spartacist League in 1968. Bob Ross, one of the founders of the Revolutionary Communist League Internationalist, has written that, quote, several of us despaired of the Spartacist League's consistent record of inactivity and left to form the first Revolutionary Communist League, oriented initially largely toward an activist perspective in collaboration with both UAWF Workers' World and, quote, New Left, end quote, elements in what was then called the Coalition for an Anti-Imperialist Movement, COAIM. Most of us were veterans of the Spartacist League's abortive participation in the, quote, revolutionary contingent, end quote, the previous year, as well as some of the Spartacist League's earliest trade union work, end quote. The first Revolutionary Communist League set forth its program in, quote, a call to action, founding principles of the Revolutionary Communist League, end quote. This document reflected both Trotskyist and New Left origins. On the one hand, it stressed, quote, the unity of theory and practice, end quote, stating that, quote, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary practice, end quote. It also stressed, quote, equally the entire body of Marxist thought upon which Leninism was built, and the monumental contributions of Leon Trotsky, which alone permit a solid understanding of the historical degeneration of the Soviet state, end quote. In conformity with the orthodox Trotskyist ideas, the, quote, call to action, end quote, called for, quote, unconditional defense of the worker states, end quote. In elaboration on this point, it said, quote, while appreciating the cataclysmic degeneration of both of the Soviet state and of Allied deferred regimes from Budapest to Peking and Hanoi, and while recognizing above all the despicably traitorous role played by international Stalinism and all its varieties within the world workers' movement, we still retain a central conception of the resolute defense of the workers' states against imperialism as an essential component of the world revolution, end quote. Finally, the Revolutionary Communist League document was orthodoxly Trotskyist in advocating, quote, truly democratic, all caps, centralism, end quote. This section argued that, quote, the disciplined vanguard party is a vital prerequisite of the revolution, but centralism loses its sense of direction and the revolution its very sense of purpose when democratic centralism is replaced by the centralism of a complacent bureaucratic, quote, regime, end quote, end quote. However, on at least 2 points, the Revolutionary Communist League, quote, call to action was distinctly new leftist. Under the head of, quote, the rising tide of reaction, end quote, the call argued that, quote, as the final stones are laid for the legal and military foundations of authoritarian rule, we sound the call both for increased vigilance and for militant self-defense. Not merely in word nor alone in encouragement to others, but in our own personal lives, revolutionists must reject both the concept of police state, quote, gun control, end quote, legislation, and any idea of obeying such laws, raising instead the banner of armed self-defense against paramilitary authoritarian forces, quote, official or otherwise, end quote. The second New Left element of the original Revolutionary Communist League statement of principles was its position, quote, against electoral frauds for mass action, end quote, which stated that, quote, for the foreseeable future we reject the very concept of such activity. Elections as such are a swamp into which the talents and energies are drained away from the areas of mass struggle where a revolutionary movement can be and is being built, end quote. Did not rule out completely the ultimate idea of a Labor Party, but was for one, quote, only if it based on truly independent workers' movement, without illusions about electoral, quote, activity, end quote, and, quote, constitutional democracy, end quote, end quote. Late in 1968, the Revolutionary Communist League merged into the Workers' World Party, quote, taking with us into that party the first openly Trotskyist positions and literature it had known in more than a decade, end quote, according to Bob Ross. He added that, quote, we rapidly found that the internal atmosphere of the workers' world stultifying, however, and found that this organization's early commitments to serious world revolutionary perspective had decayed beyond belief, and so we began to, quote, drift, end quote, out, end quote. In late 1971, a group of Workers' World Party members in New York withdrew to form the New York Revolutionary Committee, which issued several numbers of a periodical Common Ground, and most of the old Revolutionary Communist League members were in that group. A year later, quote, this evolution culminated in what was essentially a rebirth of the old Revolutionary Communist League, now styling itself Revolutionary Communist League Internationalist in order to indicate the development which had gone on, end quote. The Revolutionary Communist League Internationalist began publishing a mimeographed periodical, Internationalist News. It was edited by Peter Anton, Bob Ross, and Betty West. The third number of this publication stated the orientation of the group. It said that, quote, we seek today to wed the full, creative, and dynamic theoretical heritage of the, quote, old left, end quote, of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky to the vital, unrushing current of the militant, quote, new left, end quote, unconditionally, and with only the most marginal political criticisms, all oriented toward integrating military policy with an overall revolutionary strategy. We applaud the examples of the Days of Rage, May Day, the attacks on university, quote, defense research, end quote, centers, the bombings of Center Street, Albany, and the Pentagon, and the Black Liberation Army's defense of the ghettos against their military occupiers, end quote. This statement added that, quote, without tremor or remorse, we call for more of the same and readily accept the label, quote, weather trots, end quote, end quote. In June 1974, the Revolutionary Communist League Internationalists began publishing a printed bi-monthly newspaper, Internationalist Workers, edited by Sol Perro, R.H. Ross, and Sarah Kaplan. The first issue proclaimed that, quote, through this instrument of struggle, we hope that others may join us in the protracted battle to construct a proletarian combat party, a party capable of reintegrating the revolutionary heritage of Bolshevism that has been so often misunderstood and so often betrayed during the past 50 years, end quote. It added that the new periodical, quote, does not advance self-serving claims to, quote, papal infallibility, end quote, end quote. The first issue of the Internationalist Worker indicated the group's position on various subjects. It observed, in connection with the suppression of the Symbionese Liberation Army, that, quote, we of Revolutionary Communist League Internationalists from the outset have had a position of defense of the Symbionese Liberation Army against the bourgeois state, end quote. It referred to, quote, the USSR's necessary intervention in Czechoslovakia to halt the Dubček drift toward capitalist restoration, ... end quote. It carried a long article opposing Detente as, quote, another imperialist attack maneuver, end quote, against the USSR. This article ended with, quote, the following interim demands: the formation of people's militia in the USSR and Eastern Europe, rearm the masses. 2. No more privileges for bureaucrats and technocrats. 3. Prompt resolution of Soviet and Chinese differences according to revolutionary principles. 4. Strengthening and not reducing Warsaw Pact forces. 5. Stepping up of Soviet protection of Cuba, especially in bloody aftermath of Chile. 6. Establishment of joint Soviet-Chinese defense of the Korean, Cuban, Yemeni, and Vietnamese worker states. 7. Arming and supplying of revolutionary and national liberation forces as a matter of principle and not just opportunity. 8. Restoration and expansion of Marxism-Leninism throughout the worker states so that they can fully contribute to the world permanent revolution, end quote. Late in 1982, the Revolutionary Communist League Internationalists again sought to merge with the Workers' World Party, and until a decision had been reached, agreed to abide by the international discipline of the WRP. In December of that year, their proposals were rejected by the Workers' World Party, and according to John Palmieri, quote, the RCL Internationalist was reconstituted, end quote. The Revolutionary Communist League Internationalists began to publish Internationalist Worker. Like the Workers' World Party, it tended to take a strongly pro-Soviet line, supporting the Soviet Union's shooting down of the South Korean airliner, for instance. Let me get some water. I mean coffee. I'll go back. The focus group. A small group associated with an equally small breakaway from the main body of international Trotskyism, the Fomento Obrero Revolucionario, headed by the Mexican one-time leader of Spanish Trotskyism, Manuel Fernandez Grandizzo, better known as Grandizo Muñoz, was established in the United States in the 1970s. This was the four organizing committee in the United States, or FOCUS. The principal organizer of FOCUS was Stephen Schwartz, a young writer from San Francisco. Stephen Schwartz entered into contact with Fomento Obrero Revolucionario through correspondence, contributing occasionally to its journal published in France, Alarm. I don't know, it might be Alarme, it ends with an E. Then, after a visit to France and discussion with Muñoz in 1979, Schwartz, writing under the name S. Solsana, and a small group began publishing in San Francisco a periodical, The Alarm. The association of focus was with the international Fomento Obrero Revolucionario, was of relatively short duration. When the United States group expressed sympathy for the Spanish affiliate of the Fomento Obrero Revolucionario, which was purged by Muñoz and the international group, Muñoz responded in 1981 by expelling Focus from the international organization. Focus thereupon announced that, quote, we will carry forward the banner of Fomento Obrero Revolucionario with or without the, quote, official, end quote, approval of Muñoz, ... end quote. Elsewhere in this volume, we trace the evolution of the thinking of Grandizo Muniz, and in particular his denunciation of the trade union movement as a break on working class revolution. After their break with Muniz, the focus group expressed their unhappiness with Muniz's failure to suggest an alternative to the majority trade union movement as a field in which revolutionaries could operate. In October 1983, they published an extensive analysis of this issue, concluding that, quote, in the absence of a continuous forward dynamic within the class, such as will make the resolution of all these matters an immediate issue, we now propose that revolutionary-minded workers enter and seek to build the small anarcho-syndicalist organizations, the CNT and the Industrial Workers of the World. These at least offer a history of opposition to the union bureaucracies. To the extent that these organizations have maintained the tradition of such opposition, they should be studied, supported, and defended. End quote. If you're unaware, Grandizo Muniz signed the letter. I think it was a joint letter. Grandizo Muniz, Natalia Sadova Trotsky, and Benjamin Pare, the surrealist poet, signed a letter of resignation in like 1950 or 1949 or 1951 or something like that, from the Fourth International on the grounds of their dogmatic adherence to the degenerated workers' state thesis, whereas Trotsky's wife and widow and Grandizo Muniz and Benjamin Pare moved to embrace a conception of the USSR as state capitalist, which is probably a very embarrassing event for the mainstream of Orthodox Trotskyism. By 1984, Stephen Schwartz had dropped out of the leadership of the focus group. Its publication, The Alarm, was transferred to Portland, Oregon, quote, because the focus group here is largest and can put more effort into the magazine than the Bay Area folks, end quote. The first issue published in Portland noted that, quote, most of our members remain active in the Industrial Workers of the World, a controversial move made at the beginning of 1984. For the most part, our membership has been received positively by other Wobblies, a number welcoming us heartily because of our revolutionary positions, end quote. Something I'd like to know more about is I need to know more about the history of the Industrial Workers of the World post Bolshevik Revolution, because to my understanding, for instance, when Paul Maddock emigrated to the United States from Germany, that was who he sought out, at least initially, was the remnants of the Industrial Workers of the World, which I believe he moved to Chicago. They had a pretty strong presence. But I'd like to know more about that. I believe there's also, in San Francisco, there's a pretty prominent syndicalisty kind of thing around the people. They own City Lights? I don't think so. I can't remember what they were oriented around, but it's Penelope and Franklin Rosemont. I don't really know much about them, but they were kind of surrealist artists who were kind of IWW people in the 50s and 60s and so on. I'd like to know more about them. The proletarian tasks tendency. In the early 1980s, there was still another small group established which proclaimed its basic loyalty to Trotskyism, the proletarian tasks tendency. Its orientation was indicated by an editorial in the second issue of its periodical Workers' Review, which, after stating that, quote, we are committed to the transitional program, the reconstruction of the world Trotskyist movement on a principled basis, end quote, observed, quote, we also believe that a major political problem within these organizations that call themselves Trotskyist or communist is the tendency towards centralism and away from democracy, ... end quote. We have little further information about the origins of this group, although it apparently was based in the San Francisco area. The strange case of the National Caucus of Labor Committees. Certainly the most peculiar offshoot of Trotskyism in the United States has been the so-called National Caucus of Labor Committees. Originating in the mid to late 1960s as a dissident Trotskyist group, it had by the end of the next decade become an extreme right-wing organization. I'm not sure if this is like, what's his name? LaRouche. But let's see. Through all phases of its ideological and political evolution, the National Caucus of Labor Committees minutely followed the changes in ideas, fantasies, and even delusions of its founder and leader, Lyndon LaRouche, who until the mid-1970s called himself Lynn Marcus, a name presumably derived from Lenin and Marx. His writings made up a large part of the organization's publications, particularly its, quote, theoretical, end quote, presentations. The NCLC also followed LaRouche in one of the things which differentiated it from virtually the whole radical movement, its peculiar occupation with sex and excrement, resulting in a widespread use of scatological language bordering on the obscene, both in its leaders' and members' public speaking and into the group's written material. Dude, sign me up. That is fun. Alright. No, I think like LaRouche is like a son of a bitch, you know. So let's continue. LaRouche also set the pattern in establishing another characteristic of the NCLC, its frequent emphasis on violence. This emphasis was not confined to a theoretical issue of violence as a, quote, road to power, end quote, but the day-to-day use of violence to maintain discipline within its own organization and to seek to intimidate or destroy its political opponents. Finally, LaRouche led the NCLC in a third unique feature. Sorry, I got a National Caucus of Labor Committees. That's what NCLC stands for. National Caucus of Labor Committees. Finally, LaRouche led the National Caucus of Labor Committees in a third unique feature of the group, its delusions of grandeur. These delusions went far beyond the characteristic belief of virtually all radical groups that their ideas and probably their organization will ultimately win power and mold national and international society, as expressed, for instance, in the Fourth International's claim to, quote, be the party of the world socialist revolution, end quote. End quote. LaRouche and the National Committee of Labor Caucuses, National Caucus of Labor Committees, picture themselves as already being a major factor in national politics, which would be able to seize power within a very few years, and as giving great influence within political parties and governments of Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Far East. Indeed, the National Caucus of Labor Committees was more completely the expression of one man than any other group which had its origins in international Trotskyism. Even Trotsky never demanded and received the degree of absolute subservience and conformity which LaRouche insisted on. I think LaRouche's group, what are they called? What's the fucking German philosopher? Okay, there's Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Schiller, the Schiller Institute. I think Schiller, which I don't think has anything to do with the actual figure of Schiller, but if you like see on YouTube something from like the Schiller Institute, I believe this is like LaRouche's organization. Indeed, the National Caucus of Labor Committees was more completely the origins of the National Caucus of Labor Committees. Lyndon LaRouche Jr. was born into a family of Quaker dissidents in New Hampshire. During World War II, he was first a conscientious objector, but then changed his mind and saw non-combatant military service in the China-Burma-India theater. Lyndon LaRouche joined the Socialist Workers' Party either in 1948 or 1949 and remained in the Socialist Workers' Party until 1966. Although Lyndon LaRouche never became a major figure in the Socialist Workers' Party, as a secondary leader, he opposed the expulsion of those who were to become the Spartacist League. With the formation of the Workers' League after the expulsion of Tim Wohlforth and his followers from the Socialist Workers' Party, Lynn Marcus, which is Lyndon LaRouche's name, joined the Workers' League's ranks for a few months. A Spartacist publication commented on this period that, quote, Marcus and Wolfert, during their collaboration, claimed they were in the Iskra period, by which they meant they should act as brain trusters for the rest of the left. This concept is a consistent pillar of Marxism, Marxism. Marxism, the contention that his claim to leadership rests on his being smarter than everybody else, end quote. Marxism being LaRouche, referring to LaRouche. After a few months, Lyndon LaRouche, Lynn Marcus, withdrew from the Workers' League and joined the Spartacist League. Lyndon LaRouche was reported to have broken with the Spartacists, quote, over unanimous opposition to his position that the trouble with the Castroites was that Castro didn't know enough Marxian economics to maneuver in the world market, end quote. Subsequently, Lyndon LaRouche gave a somewhat different version of his activities right after leaving the Socialist Workers' Party, writing that he, quote, went through the process of attempting to salvage some remnants from the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. After leaving the Spartacist League, Lyndon LaRouche organized his own group, known then as the SDS Labor Committee, constituting a faction within the Students for a Democratic Society. The SDS Labor Committee played a role in the leadership of the student uprising at Columbia University in 1968. However, the Lyndon LaRouche group did not stay long with Students for a Democratic Society. The Lyndon LaRouche group were said to have broken with it over their position in support of the New York City teachers' strike in 1969. The SDS generally opposed that strike and supported the, quote, community control, end quote, program of those who opposed the walkout. Once outside of the Students for a Democratic Society, the LaRoucheites formally established the National Caucus of Labor Committees. The Statement of Founding Principles. I fucking love cranks, dude. I feel like, if they weren't so harmful, well, I suppose maybe that's what's fucking, interesting about them is that they are extremely harmful. But I love when someone gets into like fucking just goes off the fucking deep end. Maybe that's rather misanthropic of me that I really get a kick out of fucking people who go crazy and start just saying fucking socially damaging shit and promoting socially damaging shit despite without any connection to reason and science. Alright. Statement of Founding Principles. What was for half a decade or more to be the basic political document of the National Caucus for Labor Committees, its statement of founding principles was officially accepted at a national conference in January 1971. It contained the peculiar mishmash of philosophical ideas, economic notions, and political prescriptions which was then characteristic of the Marcus-LaRouche group. It also underscored the highly elitist approach to politics and essentially disparaging attitude toward the working class characteristic of the National Caucus of Labor Committees. The statement consisted of 25 numbered points. The first draft dealt with philosophical questions and contained the kind of idiosyncratic language which was becoming typical of LaRouche and his followers. For instance, point 3 said that, quote, all the conceptions of human consciousness, thought, formal, logical reasoning included, are produced by a noetic concept-creating process that determines the, quote, axioms, end quote, ... of formal reasoning, but which axioms or formal reasoning is inherently incapable of providing or explaining. That the real foundations of human knowledge in the noetic process of mind can be uncovered only by a dialectical examination of the process by which whole systems of formal logic are exposed as fallacious and totally new world conceptions produced, ... end quote. Some points have a more or less familiar Marxist ring, however, others set forth clearly the group's highly elitist ideas. Point 2 says that, quote, the central problem of humanity today is therefore the fact that the working class, as an economic class, is not capable of spontaneously becoming a political class, for itself, end quote. Point 12 goes on to say that, quote, therefore, the political existence of the working class depends on the intervention of a, quote, outside agency, end quote, whose function is to bring the political working class for itself into being. The, quote, outside agency, end quote, can only be a social formation which has already attained an advanced approximation of the working class consciousness which the working class lacks. Only a handful of the capitalist intelligentsia is capable of fulfilling this decisive role, end quote. I don't know, man. That kind of sounds pretty close to what Kautsky and Lenin had to say about the matter. Point 13 elaborated further on this, quote, revolutionary intelligentsia, end quote, which is, quote, the embryonic representation of a new human species, a Promethean species which seeks to reproduce its own kind from the ranks of the working class, end quote. Point 17 reached the logical conclusion of the previous positions, and without mentioning Lyndon LaRouche by name, proclaimed his right to determine the National Caucus of Labor Committee's ideas and activities. It said that, quote, while the cadre organization must submit to the class interest of the potential political working class for itself, that means and demands and insulating the vanguard organization from corrupting intrusions of reactionary bourgeois ideology, dominant among working people generally, oppressed minorities and radical students, etc., in a capitalist society. Realization of socialist conceptions means that alien political ideas have ipso facto no voting rights over the formation of policy within the vanguard organization. It means the less developed consciousness of socialist principles must be subordinated to the advanced consciousness within the organization, end quote. Quote, hegemony on the left, end quote. During its early years, the National Caucus of Labor Committees put great emphasis on obtaining, quote, hegemony, end quote, in left-wing U.S. politics. As early as 1970, it claimed that it was well on the way to this. The NCLC magazine Campaigner wrote that, quote, the labor committees already know a thing or two about the process of struggle for left hegemony. Our organization has been developed under simultaneous assault by both the anarchist, quote, crazies, end quote, and Progressive Labor Party, and has not only survived but grown, We did not defeat PLP by accident. Excepting the Black Panther Party, which is obviously a very special case, the National Caucus of Labor Committees has emerged to present third, quote, position, end quote, in the struggle for left hegemony in the U.S. movement, end quote. In the spring of 1973, Lyndon LaRouche decided to, quote, destroy, end quote, the Communist Party. In an editorial in New Solidarity in April entitled, quote, Death of the CPUSA, end quote, LaRouche said that, quote, readers will obtain a taste of our ruthlessness in the way we proceed to finish off the Communist Party, end quote. LaRouche said that the National Caucus of Labor Committees would, quote, conduct the most ruthless mopping up operation against each of its ragged formations, end quote. A few days later, LaRouche announced that, quote, the CP cannot hold a meeting on the East Coast, we'll mop them up in 2 months, end quote. These attacks on the Communist Party were labeled, quote, Operation Mop-Up, end quote, by LaRouche. Dennis King has described what happened, quote, according to participants, mop-up was efficiently organized. In most cases, isolated individuals or small groups were caught by surprise and overwhelmed. The flying squads often were brought from out of town so their faces would not be recognized and would leave town before the police could investigate. Former National Caucus of Labor Committee's members remember it all with shame. Quote, "We'd be 10 against 1, end quote, said one NCLC defector. Quote, "And the communist member we'd pound on would be some elderly guy," end quote, end quote. This description is confirmed by the National Caucus of Labor Committee's sources. And quote, "extra," end quote, of New Solidarity on April 16th, 1973 said that, quote, "a significant amount of CPYWLL blood was spilled at Temple University in Philadelphia last Wednesday, ... end quote. It was reported that between April and September 1973, there were at least 60 assaults by National Caucus of Labor Committee, It was reported that between April and September 1973, there were at least 60 assaults by the National Caucus of Labor Committee's people on members of the Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party. Some National Caucus of Labor Committee members were shocked by Operation Mop-Up and apparently expressed their unhappiness. LaRouche savagely attacked them in a way which was becoming characteristic in the organization. In an internal bulletin of the group, LaRouche wrote that, quote, "I am going to make you organizers, ... What I shall do is to expose you to the cruel fact of your sexual impotence, ... I will take away from you all hope that you can flee the terrors of politics to the safety of, quote, personal life," end quote. "I shall do this by showing to you that your frightened personal sexual life contains for you such terrors as the outside world could never offer you," end quote. Quote, "deprogramming and other paranoia." After Operation Mop-Up, LaRouche turned his followers' attention in another direction, bringing into play another strain of agitation and propaganda which was to become characteristic of National Committee of Labor Caucus's propaganda. National Caucus of Labor Committee's paranoia. LaRouche suddenly developed the idea that the CIA was centering attention and resources on trying to penetrate the National Caucus of Labor Committees and was, quote, "programming," end quote, its leaders and members. Most notorious was the case of Chris White, who had been the National Caucus of Labor Committee's representative in Great Britain. LaRouche summoned White home and submitted him to a process of, quote, "deprogramming," end quote, which the National Caucus of Labor Committees widely publicized. This case was followed by the, quote, "deprogramming," end quote, of various other leaders and rank-and-filers of the National Caucus of Labor Committees. LaRouche claimed that he was the only one who knew how to carry out successful, quote, "deprogramming," end quote. LaRouche, in explaining the kind of, quote, "programming," end quote, to which the National Caucus of Labor Committee's people had been exposed, said that, quote, "the victim's sense of reality is turned inside out, ... in the dozen cases, ... known to have been brainwashed for the CIA or LEAA. The victim characteristically accused the labor committees of having brainwashed its members, ... end quote. Doesn't LaRouche, I think LaRouche might have something to do with like Farrakhan and like the Million Man March, but I'm not sure. Maybe they'll talk about that. I don't know. Maybe I'm making that up. I'm not sure. LaRouche claimed that the, quote, "programming," end quote, was part of a worldwide plot. LaRouche said that, quote, "we are now in the second phase of a cyborg game designed by the CIA that is a psychological warfare game conducted on a scale of 4 continents in which the CIA is playing psychological warfare with an organization, the Labor Committee, ... end quote. LaRouche added that, quote, "there was, but that's not relevant, an assassination plot against me by the KGB," end quote. Although the publicity about LaRouche's, quote, "deprogramming," end quote, of National Caucus of Labor Committee's members was soon dropped. Both the paranoia about persecution of LaRouche and of the National Caucus of Labor Committees continued to be an article of faith, and LaRouche's own psychological methods to combat it continued. The New York Times reported in October 1979 that, quote, the party's founders conducted grueling encounter sessions to keep members in line. According to the accounts of former members, those who doubt Mr. LaRouche are summoned before a small group and grilled about their fears and guilt until they break down. Husbands or wives are asked about their partner's sexual practices, end quote. The paranoia continued. For instance, in July 1977, New Solidarity carried an article headline, quote, Carter caught red-handed in COINTELPRO versus USLP, end quote. That is, an espionage plot against the U.S. Labor Party, then the public face of the National Caucus of Labor Committees. In October 1978, the same newspaper had an article headlined, quote, Zionist assassination threat on LaRouche is put on front burner, end quote. The, quote, intelligence network, end quote. In September 1971, the National Caucus of Labor Committees first established its, quote, intelligence network, end quote. This is a unique organization in which members of the group channeled information to the NCLC headquarters from all over the United States and subsequently from Europe and Latin America. The national organization then distributed this information through a series of publications and through, quote, briefings, end quote. It is not entirely clear just who attended these, quote, briefings, end quote, although there was mention in the National Caucus of Labor Committee's press of daily meetings of the group's national committee at which members were told of information the intelligence network had acquired. Early in 1975, a document entitled A Fact Sheet, What Are the Labor Committees? And the National Caucus of Labor Committees claimed that, quote, Labor Committee intelligence has always functioned in the way the research departments of a major news service should function. This fact-gathering capability is supplemented with currently increasing importance by information contributed from workers and others associated with the day-to-day activities of the labor committees and Labor Party, end quote. The National Caucus of Labor Committees claimed special competence for its news gathering. The same document said that, quote, in the process of cumulative research into current political developments and related strategic matters, our intelligence work has aggregated special competence in respect to the behind-the-scenes processes largely governing the explicit activities of governments, end quote. As one who was upon occasion approached and provided with National Caucus of Labor Committees, quote, intelligence, end quote, about Latin American countries, the author can testify that these, quote, inside stories, end quote, were more often than not flights of fancy rather than inside information. LaRouche NCLC Economic Social Program. In the mid-1970s, Lyndon LaRouche and the National Caucus of Labor Committees put forward a global economic and social program, which they never entirely abandoned. It consisted principally of their proposal for an international development bank, the establishment of a, quote, transfer ruble, end quote, as a new world currency and fusion power as a solution to all the world's energy problems. They published their World Economic Program as a pamphlet, IDB, How the International Development Bank Will Work, and elaborated on it endlessly in their presses. An article by Kriton Zokes, quote, National Caucus of Labor Committee's Director of Intelligence, end quote, proclaimed that, quote, there is absolutely not one single solitary alternate road for putting the world economy together again except the way we've described, end quote. The National Caucus of Labor Committees explained their proposed International Development Bank as bringing together the tremendous productive possibilities of the industrial countries and the great development needs of the poor nations. Quote, formally, the International Development Bank comes into existence in a manner analogous to the effective financial reorganization of any major bank being rescued from illiquidity collapse. A new bank is created to continue the essential operations of the old, while major categories of unpayable carried forward indebtedness are placed in a moratorium, quote, deep freeze, end quote, and negotiations for future liquidation of that debt are conducted separately from day-to-day operations of the new institution, end quote. The idea of a debt moratorium for the developing countries became a permanent part of the, quote, program, end quote, of the National Caucus of Labor Committees, but they did not continue to emphasize the International Development Bank. More idiosyncratic was LaRouche's proposal for a, quote, transferable ruble, end quote, as a new world currency. Kriton Zokes described this by saying that, quote, when we establish the transferable ruble standard as a reserve currency, it will create with this flow of trade from Western Europe into Eastern Europe a transferable ruble surplus into Western Europe. At the same time, it creates a transferable ruble indebtedness of third world countries to the Comecon. Now, Western Europe still continues to require commodity and raw material imports from the third world, for which it pays with its surplus transferable rubles. Thus, it provides the third world countries the means with which to pay their obligations to the Comecon sector, end quote. This description is not so markedly different from the way in which the, quote, transferable dollar, end quote, has functioned as a world currency since World War II. The major problem with it as a practical proposition, of course, is the fact that the Soviet ruble has never been, quote, transferable, end quote, and there has been no indication that the pre-Gorbachev Soviet Union leadership has ever considered the possibility of allowing free purchase and sale of their national currency. The third element in the socioeconomic program of LaRouche and the National Caucus of Labor Committees was emphasis on atomic power. It particularly emphasized the possibilities of, quote, fusion power, end quote, a kind of nuclear energy which in theory is exceedingly productive and, quote, clean, end quote, but which is only in the early development stage. The National Caucus of Labor Committees organized a fusion energy foundation with the purpose of pushing this particular panacea, and much of the attention the National Caucus of Labor Committees received came from its members at airports and other transport centers who distributed and sold literature supporting atomic energy. The National Caucus of Labor Committees conspiracy mania. By the mid-1970s, Lyndon LaRouche and therefore the National Caucus of Labor Committees had developed an extensive conspiracy theory of history. The objective of the conspiracy, according to them, was to dominate the world or to destroy it if control was impossible. The details of the conspiracy were developed by LaRouche over a number of years. Dennis King explained the full development of LaRouche conspiracy theory as of 1982. Quote, LaRouche claimed that an evil, quote, oligarchy, end quote, a conspiratorial elite of usurers opposed to industrial or scientific progress, emerged in ancient Babylon, at the time of the Jewish captivity, and molded the Jewish religion into a, quote, cult, end quote, to be employed as its fifth column. This oligarchy, the, quote, whore of Babylon, end quote, supposedly set itself apart from humanity, developed a cosmopolitan anti-human tradition, shifted its headquarters to the West, and conspired through the centuries to achieve global dominance, end quote. Kings added that, quote, in the era of capitalism, the oligarchy allegedly moved to London under the leadership of the Rothschilds, and using the Churchill family and the Freemasons as its cover, it subverted the English aristocracy. It then concocted the, quote, cult, end quote, of Zionism to supplement Judaism as an international tool, end quote. For a number of years, the National Caucus of Labor Committees claimed that Nelson Rockefeller was the center of the worldwide conspiracy. The extent to which this argument went was shown in a lead article in January 5th, 1978 issue of New Solidarity. It started by noting that, quote, in the last 48 hours, the populations of Northern Europe and sections of the East Bloc have been hit with the worst storm in Europe in 29 years, end quote. The article went on to assert that, quote, only Rockefeller, Kissinger, and their National Security Council apparatus have the motive, capability, and opportunity to carry out such an insane outrage as this against the working people of Western Europe and of the East Bloc, end quote. Later, LaRouche dropped Nelson Rockefeller as the focus of his conspiracy theory and denounced President Jimmy Carter. Typical of the National Caucus of Labor Committee's statements in this period was the one of Bruce Todd, the National Caucus of Labor Committee's U.S. Labor Party candidate for Congress in the 15th District of New Jersey, who was quoted in October 1976 as saying that, quote, if Jimmy Carter is elected, the United States will be in a thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union within 6 to 7 months after his inauguration, end quote. Of course, this, like most of LaRouche's National Caucus of Labor Committee confident predictions of the future disasters did not come to pass. These failures were usually explained on the basis of the National Caucus of Labor Committees having prevented them by denouncing their likelihood. Typical was a throwaway of the U.S. Labor Party entitled, quote, Kissinger unleashes terrorists on United States, end quote, which commented that, quote, you know about Kissinger's and Rockefeller's bloody schemes to start a nuclear war, ... Kissinger and Rockefeller tried this operation once before in January 1974. At that time, the U.S. Labor Party's mass inoculation against U.S. terror operations forced them to pull back, ... end quote. It has been frequently argued that anti-Semitism is the underlying theme of the LaRouche National Caucus Labor Committee's conspiracy theory developed in the 1970s. There were certainly frequent references to Jewish bankers not necessarily identified explicitly as Jews, as evil figures of the past and present. There were also many attacks on, quote, Zionists, end quote, under circumstances which might as well read, quote, Jews, end quote. Open appeals to antipathy against Jews were relatively rare. Nonetheless, there were sometimes such open anti-Semitic outbursts. For example, in an article dealing with supposed espionage of the federal government against the National Caucus of Labor Committees, Kosta Kalimkis wrote in 1977 that, quote, NBC, which is owned by our crowd, investment houses, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, Kuhn, Loeb, and the Schiff Warburg Group, and Lazard Freres, and whose board of directors were large contributors and backers of the Carter campaign, were scheduling a half-hour slander program on the U.S. Labor Party, ... end quote. This clash with the National Broadcasting Company had interesting results. Lyndon LaRouche lodged a suit for $150 million in federal district court in Alexandria, Virginia, on the claim that NBC had, quote, defamed, end quote, him. LaRouche lost that suit, but NBC was awarded $3 million in a countersuit which, quote, charged that people in the organization of Mr. LaRouche interfered with NBC's news gathering while the network was preparing reports on him, end quote. The United States Labor Party. For a number of years, the National Caucus of Labor Committees worked through the U.S. Labor Party as its electoral vehicle. They ran numerous local candidates, and in 1976, Lyndon LaRouche himself was the party's presidential nominee. They claimed to believe that he would be elected. New Solidarity said that, quote, the ballot strategy is to conduct petition drives in the 20 states where the Labor Party is strongest and in 10 contiguous populous states where the party has extensive penetration, ... The 20 states where the Labor Party local offices are now located comprise about 3/4 of the U.S. population and account for 54%, 289 of the Electoral College vote. The additional 10 target states represent another 56 Electoral College votes, bringing the target total electoral vote to 345. ... A total of 270 Electoral College votes is required to win the presidency and vice presidency. End quote. Once the election was over, LaRouche and his followers made two claims: that they had gotten a larger vote than any other left-wing candidate in U.S. history, and that Gerald Ford and not Jimmy Carter had won the election. Their, quote, analysis, end quote, of the election results claimed that LaRouche had received 3,500,000 votes, rather than the 18,500 votes which he had been officially credited. In New York State, it was claimed that LaRouche had received 384,000 votes, rather than the official 1,727. Charging, quote, fraud, end quote, in the election count, the National Caucus of Labor Committees said that, quote, the present parading of Jimmy Carter as the president-elect is a patently fraudulent act being carried out by the three major television networks and the two wire services, ... end quote. This new Solidarity article modestly promised that if Gerald Ford should, quote, choose ... not to seek the presidency ... LaRouche, in the interest of national security and national unity, announced at the same time his willingness to avail himself as a candidate for president-elect in case Dole also chooses not to ask for the Electoral College vote, end quote. Almost 2 years after the 1976 election, LaRouche, still billed as the chairman of U.S. Labor Party, claimed a major role for the party in U.S. politics. He stated that, quote, the U.S. Labor Party declares the de facto existence of a new political leadership in the United States. We propose to name this new leadership the American Whig Policy Coalition. The coalition will include the U.S. Labor Party, of course, but will also include Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, which as a combination will determine who is president of the U.S. in January 1981, end quote. The National Democratic Policy Committee. In spite of aligning himself with far-right Republicans in the campaign to annul the results of the 1976 election, in 1979, LaRouche and the National Caucus of Labor Committees switched tactics. They buried the U.S. Labor Party, established instead the National Democratic Policy Committee, and decided to work inside the Democratic Party. In the 1980 election, LaRouche ran in 14 Democratic state primaries. The National Caucus of Labor Committees raised enough money in that campaign to qualify for $526,000 in matching funds from the Federal Election Commission, a body which LaRouche and the National Caucus of Labor Committees had violently denounced 4 years before. During the 1980 campaign, the National Caucus of Labor Committees and LaRouche indicated that they had not changed their nature. LaRouche, quote, contended that he was the target of an international conspiracy to kill him, end quote. When his people left New Hampshire, a, quote, New Hampshire target list, end quote, was found in the motel room of one of LaRouche's campaign workers, including the names of mayors and city clerks of several New Hampshire cities and towns and other people with the notation, quote, these are criminals to be burnt. We want calls coming into these fellows day and night. Use your networks to best advantage, end quote. Attorney General Rath, one of those on the list, commented, quote, that would be consistent with the calls I received. I got about 50 home calls on Sunday, ... Some of the callers said, quote, we know where you live, end quote, end quote. 2.5 years later, the National Democratic Policy Committee received publicity in the May 1985 local school board election in New York City, where it ran candidates in several districts. Both the New York Times and Albert Shanker, president of the American Federation of Teachers, urged the voters not to support the group. Early in 1984, the National Democratic Policy Committee ran a number of school board candidates in New Jersey. Those candidates were all defeated overwhelmingly. In Piscataway, where there were originally only 2 candidates running for 3 posts, and the LaRouche Group's nomination of 2 additional ones would have assured the election of one, a write-in campaign brought victory of the write-in nominee by 3.5 to 1 over the leading LaRouche nominee. In the 1984 general election, LaRouche again sought the Democratic nomination. LaRouche received $185,000 in matching funds from the Federal Electoral Commission. After the primary campaign, LaRouche ran as a, quote, independent Democrat, end quote, getting on the ballot in 19 states. Linda LaRouche was officially credited with having gotten 78,773 votes. A New Jersey political commentator, Tom Hester, noting the presence of LaRouche's candidates in that state, observed about the recent evolution of the group's ideas that, quote, the movement runs on an odd blend of political dogma. It warns of a corporate Marxist conspiracy to control the world while criticizing the Polish solidarity effort. Last year, it locked on to Republican President Ronald Reagan's Star Wars proposal for the development of laser beam technology to blow away incoming Soviet missiles and has become its major proponent. LaRouche believes the Holocaust was a hoax, end quote. Hester went on, quote, Elliot Greenspan, 34 of Haworth, the NDPC's New Jersey coordinator, is running as a beam technology Democrat for the U.S. Senate against Senator Bill Bradley, Democrat of New Jersey. The NDPC has candidates in 8 of New Jersey's 14 congressional races. Last year, the group ran on the, quote, beam technology, stop war, ban depression, end quote, ticket in the Democratic legislative primary. One of its assembly candidates won the primary by default in Somerset when the county Democratic Party failed to field a candidate to oppose him, end quote. By 1985, the newspaper of the LaRouche Group, New Solidarity, was carrying on its banner the description, quote, nonpartisan national newspaper of the American system, end quote. The LaRouche Group suffered at least one small split. This took place in 1974. A small group called Centers for Change, describing itself as a Marxist-Leninist Maoist organization and led by Fred Newman, joined the National Caucus of Labor Committees. God, this is fun. But 2 months later, Fred Newman resigned from the LaRouche Group, subsequently forming the International Workers' Party. After quitting the National Caucus of Labor Committees, Newman published a pamphlet, A Manifesto on Method, in which Fred Newman commented that, quote, from the very beginning of our contact with comrades of the ICLC, I think it's supposed to be LCLC, Labor Caucus, or no, maybe not. I don't know. ICLC in October 1973, we have worked hard to change that organization while respecting its historically just claim to hegemony. The former workers of the CPC and the ICLC who founded the International Workers' Party take proper pride in the principled manner in which this struggle was conducted, frequently in the face of substantial personal abuse, end quote. There is no information available about the subsequent evolution of the IWP. Which is International Workers' Party. Conclusions about National Caucus of Labor Committees. It would appear that an individual or social psychologist could best describe and explain the National Caucus of Labor Committees and its leader, Lyndon LaRouche. It is in many ways unique in its evolution, not only away from orthodox Trotskyism, but from Trotskyism of any kind. Although in the United States and many other countries there have been many individuals who after leaving the Trotskyist ranks became conservatives or even reactionaries, no other Trotskyist group as such had this kind of trajectory. More than any other Trotskyist faction, it degenerated into a sect or, quote, cult, end quote, completely subordinate to and dedicated to the exaltation of a particular individual, its founder, Lyndon LaRouche. Conclusion. It is clear that the groups in the United States which have had their roots, however tenuously, in international Trotskyism have evolved in diverse directions. A few of these remained more or less loyal to the ideas expressed by Leon Trotsky, quarreling more with fellow Trotskyists than with Trotsky himself. Others, however, have taken positions as diverse as a more or less clear alignment with the heirs of Stalin, an association with anarcho-syndicalism, and a more move totally across the political spectrum from the far left to the far right. All right, dude. I've completed the end of the United States section of this book. I'm very proud of myself. Thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of it. And I hope you didn't mind miscellaneous comments by myself.